Water bath canning is an easy way to preserve tomatoes, fruit, or other high-acid foods for shelf-stable storage. I'm Marisa McDonald with Pacific Northwest Suburban Homesteading, and today I'm going to go over the basics for water bath canning. Let's get started. You have tomatoes you want to make into sauce, or you want to make home-canned chili for quick meals. How do you know what to do? The best place to start is with a tested recipe from a reliable source. I'll talk more about that in a bit. So, water bath, also called boiling water canning or pressure canning. That depends on the food you want to put up. The acid in food prevents pathogens that survive the cooking process from spoiling food and making people sick. Foods like meat and vegetables that don't have much acid to help must be processed at a higher temperature than 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius of boiling water to do the same thing. I'll talk about pressure canning low acid foods in a future video. Once you have your recipe, you will need to assemble your gear. I have a traditional enameled canner, but you absolutely do not need to buy one. My stock pot works just as well and is of better quality and will last longer. For small batches, you can actually use any pot with a lid. It just needs to be deep enough for the jars you're using plus 1 inch of water to cover them. Basic canning kits are inexpensive and make things easier, but are unnecessary. Here you see the equipment that I have. There's a jar funnel, a jar lifter, a bubble remover tool with a magnet, and a headspace tool that also could be used to remove bubbles. The equipment that you already own can work just fine if you need to keep costs down though. Once you've prepared your food, set up the canner. I partially fill mine and turn the water on high while I wash my jars. We will need to thoroughly wash, inspect, and sterilize the jars before filling them. They come in a wide variety of shapes and set sizes. I have quart, pint, half pint, and quarter pint for canning. These ones are all half pints, for instance. They are wide mouth and regular mouth. Regular mouth is sometimes called narrow or small mouth. I like to hand wash my jars, but others use their dishwashers. Jars and lids are the only things you need something specially made for canning. You must use mason jars. Reuse of items is great, but do not try to use old mayonnaise jars or other single-use glass jars. I know people who have succeeded, but don't risk it. Mason jars are made of specialty glass that can withstand the stresses of the heat from pressure canning and repeated use. It is incredibly upsetting to work hard making something just to have your jars break in the canner. Inspect your jars for flaws and damage. Here's a jar with bubbles in the glass. That makes a weak spot that can break in the canner. Here's a jar with a chip in the rim. This could mean that the lid does not properly seal. This one is probably still usable since the chip is in the threads, but I'm concerned that it may break in use. I use my jam jars for lots of other uses. They are just not safe to use for canning. Load your clean jars into the canner and bring the water up to a boil. Add water as needed to make sure your jars are completely submerged. Boil them for 10 minutes. While we wait for the jars, let's prepare our lids. Lids and jar rings come in 2 standard sizes no matter the size of the jar. They are wide mouth or regular. Most commonly, people use single-use metal lids with a sealing compound. The new standard just requires washing without needing to simmer them to soften the compound. Many home canners still simmer them as insurance, which is perfectly okay. There were a lot of substandard lids during the recent shortages from supply chain disruptions, so many people has understandably returned to older practices to enhance proper sealing. Don't boil them though, as it can damage the sealing compound. Plenty of the old style are still out there, so make sure you check the instructions printed on the back of the box. I recently learned about reusable canning lids. I purchased a set of Tattler lids to try out. They're similar and use the same jar rings as the metal ones. They're made of a durable plastic with replaceable rubber gaskets. Unlike the venerable metal lids, not much research has been done to study their use yet. Most information is from home canners and the company itself. There is one study supporting them as safe to use out of the University of Georgia though. I added a link to the resource list in the description. Before we start filling our jars, it is important to know the amount of lemon juice or citric acid to add to our tomato sauce or other food. Tomatoes are high in acid and should be safe all on their own, but the juice or citric acid is to ensure the acid levels are high enough. In nature, the acid varies because of a lot of variables. Don't worry, the added stuff does not change the flavor in the slightest. My sauce is sweeter and more flavorful than commercial sauce and isn't at all lemony. Also, check to see what the required headspace is. Pull your jars out of the boiling water. You can boil your jars in a separate stock pot, but I usually use the canner to save water and effort. The only time I use a separate pot is when I'm doing larger amounts and need more jars than this canner will hold in one batch. Put your rack in the canner if it is not already in there. If you don't have a fancy rack like this, you can use a cooling rack or other item on the bottom to raise the jars off the bottom of the canner. Probably should have done that when sterilizing my jars. I like this rack because it sits on the sides of the canner so I can put all of my filled jars in and then lower into the water fully once the batch is ready to process. Now that we know how much lemon juice, let's add it to the jars. I do this first so I don't forget and to avoid overfilling my jars. I've kept my sauce on a burner set to low to keep it hot during the canning prep. A ladle and jar funnel reduce the mess as I filled my jars to the headspace line. I've always used the quick and dirty shorthand method of judging headspace based on the jar screw threads. My canning book has a diagram using the threads to judge headspace. I recently bought this nifty device though. It is a better way to gauge more precisely. I did not have it yet when I recorded the tomato sauce video I used for the examples, however. Wipe down the top of your jar with a damp paper towel before putting the lids on. Anything left on there can interfere with the sealing process, especially when you're canning something sticky like sweet relish or tomato sauce. Once your jar is clean, put the lid on, then screw the jar ring on to finger tight. The ring is mostly there to keep the lid in place until the submersion in boiling water heats and forces the air out, creating a vacuum. Load the jar into your rack or directly into the canner if you don't have one. If you are using a rack, lower it down into the water once it is full. You'll need the jars covered by at least an inch of water. I'm using a crude method to estimate the level while avoiding burning myself. Yes, I like precision and probably should have used a ruler. This does not really need that level of precision, however. Now that I have my nifty new headspace tool, I can use that. In this case, I definitely do need to add more water. Put the lid on the canner and turn up the heat. Bring your water to a full boil. Adjust it as necessary to keep a steady boil. Don't make a mess by boiling too hard like I did. Set a timer based on your recipe. Tomato sauce takes 15 minutes, but different recipes require different amounts of time. The timing is important to make sure all of the bacteria, enzymes, etc. are neutralized or killed. That's why I mentioned using a tested recipe from a reliable source earlier. Okay, back to reliable sources. An experienced canner recommended the Ball Blue book to me when I was starting. This is the most current version because I like to have the most recent science to rely on to keep my family safe. Canning advice changes as we learn more and the microorganisms that cause spoilage and illness evolve. Ball and Extension Services base their instructions and process times on testing and established science. As tempting as it is, don't use Grandma's old canning book. The processing times may have changed to combat more resistant bacteria, molds, etc. This particular book specializes in recipes for small amounts. I've used it to make honey mustard and other things 3 or 4 pints at a time. Local extension agencies are super helpful as well. Oregon State University has a great website, as do extension services in other states. I have included links for the books and the online resources in the description below. Once your timer has gone off, turn the burner off, remove the canner lid, and wait 5 minutes. After that time has elapsed, lift out your rack and set it on the edge of the canner. Move the jars to a towel or other padded spot to cool for 12 to 24 hours. Leave space around each jar to allow air to circulate. Metal lids often make a cool pinging sound as the jars seal. After the jars have cooled, remove the rings. Often the rings will be loose when you pull the jars out of the canner at the end of processing, but don't worry, they already did their job. Test the seal by lifting the jars by the lid about an inch above the towel. If they did not seal properly, the lid will come off. You can either reprocess or, better yet, put the jar in the refrigerator and use within 2 weeks. I have heard of other ways to check, such as pushing on the center to see if the metal fluxes or thumping them and somehow determining through the sound it makes. Don't do this. The lift method is the best way because it will pull the lid off if they have not formed a solid seal, something the other ways may not reveal. Label each jar lid with the contents and the date. Trust me on this one. You might think you'll remember what is in there, but too many foods look too similar after canning. Store them away from light and excessive heat. Congratulations! You now know how to preserve food using the water bath canning method. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Until next time, be curious, keep an open mind, and never stop learning.